Welcome. I'm John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. All the lights are flashing on the dashboard of the November elections. Is it credible that President Trump will attempt to disrupt or even cancel the November 2026 congressional elections? We've got to talk about this. There's deterrence in flagging the credible possibility. We can anticipate that the disruption will come by way of an executive order. Doesn't the motive grow stronger as the case for impeachment continues to mount? Given the fact that Trump said that he isn't constrained by anything other than his moral conscience, our Constitution and laws are irrelevant. For political purposes, Trump may argue the electoral process is being corrupted. By whom? Who knows? It's Chinese, immigrants. Are you appalled or alarmed by the recent interview exchange between President Trump and the New York Times? The New York Times reporter said, and I quote, "You threatened during the 2020 election to use the National Guard to seize election boxes. You may remember that. You didn't, in the end, do it." To which Trump replied, quote, "Well, I should have," close quote. Tonight, we welcome back Trevor Potter, founder and president of the Campaign Legal Center. Trevor is our go-to guy on elections. You may recall the stimulating November 2024 Salon when Trevor analyzed the last presidential election. Tonight, Trevor is joined by the Campaign Legal Center's Executive Director, Adav Noti. The Campaign Legal Center is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization which works through our judicial system to protect the integrity of our electoral processes, to safeguard separation of powers, and to enforce the rule of law. Since the Constitution gives states and Congress the power to set election rules, the president has no role. The center is covering all the bases in all 50 states. The center is challenging illegal executive orders on voting and elections, blocking the Justice Department from unlawfully obtaining sensitive voter data from the states, and building opposition on Capitol Hill to the Anti-Voter SAVE Act. Trevor, welcome back.
Thank you, John. It's great to be back with the Committee for the Republic. Good to see so many friends in the audience. And very happy to be here with my friend and colleague, Adav Noti, who is deep into all of these issues and leading much of CLC's work in this area. So I think between the two of us, we will be able to give a good summary of what we see happening, what the threats are, and we look forward to a conversation with you all about that. I'm going to start with a sort of context framing of where we are in terms of the president's attacks on state power over election and attempts to, I think, set the stage for an attempt at usurping those states' rights if he doesn't like the way the elections are going. And I'm going to do that by looking at the broader constitutional issues that many of you are very familiar with, and then the specifics of what the president has started to do in the election area. And then I'm going to turn it over to Adav to dive to what CLC is doing in terms of fighting those actions. And then we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. So, John, again, thank you for the invitation. In terms of the broad context setting, as you all know, we have a constitution created by our founders with a separation of powers. They looked at the British system, and much of what we have is a reaction to that. They did not want centralized power. They didn't want the monarch, the king, the president to have broad authority. They believed in a diffusion of power, and they believed that more voices and more minds were better than one. And in order to protect the republic they'd created, they diffused authority over elections in particular, so that each state is supposed to run their own elections, and the Constitution gives the power to Congress to revise and establish time, place, and manner of federal elections. Notably, it doesn't give the president any role at all in that. So the goal of our separation of powers, as the Committee for the Republic knows and has discussed for some, excuse me, the pollen is getting to me, as discussed for some years now, is that the first chamber, the first branch, Congress, has a range of authority. The president is to execute the laws, and Congress is to make the laws. This runs into a theory that has been propounded in conservative legal circles now for several decades called the unitary executive. The idea that the president controls the executive branch and therefore should have essentially unfettered authority over anything the executive branch does. Now, the problem with this is it runs directly into the fact that Congress has limited the president's authority over aspects of the executive branch, particularly the creation of independent agencies with term appointments for commissioners, requirements that commissioners may only, or other federal officials may only be dismissed for cause. And as you know, there are Supreme Court precedents that say that means the president can't just fire independent agency commissioners. Those have been cut back by more recent court decisions and are directly being challenged by this administration. But where this leaves you is with a conflict between the president promising to administer the laws and the president saying the laws don't apply to me, they're unconstitutional, I don't recognize them. And we've seen this battle over a whole range of issues, whether it is Congress's control over spending, the power of the president to impound or not impound, certainly war powers and battles over Congress's power, the War Powers Act, etc. But many of these issues are currently before the Supreme Court in the FTC case, where the president has fired a commissioner of the FTC and argues that he didn't need a cause and could do so because he didn't like them, regardless of the limitations that Congress had established in legislation. So the Campaign Legal Center believes that that is a really dangerous violation of the separation of powers. And let me note here, I think that we talk about separation of powers as if each branch had clearly defined powers that were only theirs. And I think that's just a misunderstanding. What we're talking about really is a sharing of powers. Congress passes legislation, it doesn't become law unless the president agrees and signs it, or it is enacted over the president's veto by a supermajority. And many of those laws create a sharing of powers between Congress, the president, and in some cases, the courts. And so this attempt to seize full executive authority it has, I think, some serious implications for our constitutional structure. What we did in that case is to file a brief saying if you essentially are unwise enough to try to undo earlier decisions and give the president broader authority despite legislation to the contrary, then you should recognize that there are independent agencies that are specifically designed to be independent of the president for good reason. Now, we all know the court seems to think the Federal Reserve fits into that because, heaven forbid, the president should upset the markets. But what about the Federal Election Commission, which regulates aspects of elections, the reporting of contributions, the prohibitions on illegal contributions? The federal election laws are enforced by the FEC for federal candidates. If the president has the power to essentially control that agency, fire commissioners, as he has in this term, then he can use it for partisan purposes. If you go back and look at the history, Congress only established the FEC because it was going to be independent of any administration and party. Coming out of the Nixon White House, they didn't want the Justice Department enforcing election laws. They didn't trust the president, so they wanted an independent agency, 3 commissioners of each party, of any one party, and 4 votes required for any action. And so the danger here is that whether it's the Federal Election Commission or the Election Assistance Commission or some of the ethics responsibilities of the federal government, where executive branch employees are subject to ethics laws, if the president has the ability to override those and take control of these agencies for the benefit of himself personally, his family, his party, we really lose an important aspect of congressional control and separation of powers. So those are the sorts of concerns that underlie what we're seeing the president do in the area of executive orders on elections. Now, as I think everyone recognizes, the phrase executive orders does not appear in the Constitution. It's a relatively new, historically, innovation, and it was intended to be and was described as the president telling the members of the executive branch responsible to him how he interpreted the laws and how they should follow the laws. It was to provide a roadmap to ensure that Congress's intentions in the laws, as understood by the president, were carried out. So we're already in an impossible situation where executive orders are issued directly contrary to law and contrary to what Congress's intent was and the intent of the presidents when signing these laws. So they are supposed to be advisory. They do not in and of themselves have the force of law. So when the president issued last March an executive order on elections, we filed suit almost immediately in federal district court in Washington, saying the president doesn't have any constitutional authority to tell states how to run elections or to tell the Election Assistance Commission what it has to do, because that's an independent commission. And the court issued a preliminary injunction and then permanent injunctions in our suits and some brought by others, all aimed at that executive order. And starting off where the brilliant John Henry started off this call by saying, the president isn't mentioned in the election powers clauses in the Constitution, and he does not have authority to tell really anyone how to run federal elections, either independent agencies in the federal government or states. So that was a very solid victory. The Justice Department has appealed that, but so far the permanent injunction stands. So that was followed by a second presidential executive order that was issued this year, about a year later from the first one. So quite recently, the end of March. And we, again, I think within 48 hours, filed suit on this, asking the court to assign it to Judge Kolar Catelli, the federal district judge who had issued the first permanent injunctions, on the basis that it is essentially is the same case. The president is telling different actors to do different things, but all on the basis of power he doesn't have. In this case, and this is where Adav will talk about the underlying implications of this, but it's quite troublesome because the first thing that the president and the executive branch are trying to do is to create a national voter database that will have in it information about every voter in the country. And their attempt is to marry that with immigration databases or green card bases or other federal databases so that they could produce essentially a Trump list of people who are allowed to vote. And then the second piece of this is, for those of us who know the post office, even more bizarre, which is to tell the post office they have to enforce this and should not deliver ballots to people who are not on the list, which, the post office is a corporation created by Congress with a board that is not subject, and the Postmaster General are not subject to direct presidential control. And it has an obligation under existing law to deliver all mail to all persons. And they have no authority to decide not to deliver some mail because the president told them not to. The underlying problem with the list is that so far, everything we know is that it will be inaccurate. We simply are not at a place where there are sufficient accurate matching lists that we can ensure that people are not being impermissibly excluded from the right to vote because somebody got their name wrong, so there was a misspelling, there was improper information in the Social Security files. States work very hard on cleaning up their voter lists and ensuring that they're accurate. And they have problems with computers. And so trying to dump all this into a federal list is going to create a imperfect list and have very direct effects on individuals if the president even had the right to create such a database, and Congress has, for good reason, not authorized him to do so. So one of the things CLC is doing is assisting states in opposing this or fighting states that are attempting to give the president information from their confidential voter files. The names of voters are publicly available in states, but what the administration wants is people's birth dates, their social security numbers, and that is usually a violation of either state law or federal privacy law. And it's important that states not do that. What's interesting here is you're getting a bit of a cross-partisan ideological response. Libertarian states are opposing this, or officials who are libertarian leading saying correctly that it's a violation of privacy and we don't want the federal government having a massive and incorrect database. So it is not just states with Democratic leadership that are trying to say no, and the Department of Justice is suing them over this. So those are the materials that we have been involved in. So Adav, beyond the two executive orders, and thus these battles over the state lists and absentee balloting, I should have said that another piece of the executive order by the president is purporting to tell states that they cannot accept ballots that are lawfully cast but delayed by the mail and received after Election Day. Other than that, what do you see the issues being, and what are the concerns that this group should be aware of?
Sure, thanks, and thank you, John, and everybody for a chance to be here tonight. So, right, so I'll talk now about sort of what we see as the top threats to or risks of the 2026 elections. Um, and then so I'll run through sort of the top five or so threats and then talk about what we're going to do about those and what we are doing about those. Just one quick word before I get into that. When I say we, what we are doing. So Trevor and I lead Campaign Legal Center, and we're doing much of this work, but we do all of it with a significant pro-democracy ecosystem. It spans national legal groups, national grassroots groups, in-state groups. There are many, many organizations and people out there working on this. So when I say what we are doing, it is both our work at Campaign Legal Center's work, but also in coalition. Next slide, Peter. All right. So what are the top risks to the 2026 election? So first, I think both John and Trevor alluded to this, and when we're talking about risk to elections, we have to remember elections in the United States, even federal elections, are not run by the federal government. They're run by state and local governments. And so when we talk about the top risks, that is likely where problems are going to rise at the state and local level. So I think the number one threat to the 2026 elections, which is actually the same as the number one threat to the 2024 and 2022 elections, is that we are going to have election officials at the state or county level, Peter Advance, refuse to certify election results in their jurisdictions. They're going to say, I don't like these results. I think there's something wrong with them, or there's a problem, and I am not going to certify. I'm not going to certify these winners. That is not proper action for an election official. Election officials, the act of certification means I have done the math and it adds up, and that is it. And if there are challenges to votes that were cast, if there are challenges to the totals being accurate, those are handled through recount procedures or contest procedures or other state or through litigation. It is not for election officials to say, I'm going to refuse to certify an election because I don't like it. But we know coming out of 2020, and that this has been very public, the election denial movement sees this as a real weak point in the system and has seeded people in state and county election agencies and positions all around the country who were prepared to do this. And they were prepared to do it in 2024. They ended up not needing to activate those plans because they were happy with the results of the election. But they're in place and ready to do it. I'll talk a little bit about how we stop this, but I think this is, of all the things that might go wrong in November, this strikes me as the most likely. The other thing we may see, or pretty likely to see at the state level in terms of a real problem in November, relates to voter registration and voter purges. So this is already happening. Some states and some counties all around the country are already purging their rolls using, as Trevor alluded to, using a federal database that was not designed for this purpose. This is a federal database that was cobbled together by the folks who ran Doge last year from a whole bunch of different data sources. And some states and some counties are already, they're sending their voter rolls to this database. And the database is telling them, here are all the people on your voter roll who we can't verify are citizens of the United States. It's hard to get access to these communications. They're not being done out in the open for sort of obvious reasons. But to the extent these have been made public, the error rate in these notifications from the federal database appears to be in the roughly 90% range. In other words, roughly 90% of the people they identify as potential non-citizens are in fact citizens of the United States. Of the remaining 10%, many of them either are not in fact people at all. They're errors or incorrect names or misspellings. Or they are people who were automatically registered and have never voted. The actual number of non-citizens found on the live voting rolls has been minuscule even by this database. But the states who get these notifications are purging the people anyway and sending them letters saying, we've been notified you may not be a United States citizen, and if you don't prove that you are, we're going to throw you off the rolls. Now, that this is happening now is problematic, but it's fixable. So somebody who is purged from the rolls now has a chance to re-register. That's not ideal, but it is fixable. The concern is that this could happen much closer to the election with very large numbers of people. So if you have 10,000, 100,000, 500,000 people being thrown off the voter rolls as supposed non-citizens in October, they do not have time to re-register. They may not even know. And then they're going to show up to vote and be told you can't vote. You were thrown off the rolls. It is supposed to be illegal to purge voters in the last 90 days before an election under federal law, but the Supreme Court, in a case in 2024, signaled very clearly that it would not enforce that law if it came to it. And so this is a major concern going into the election. So those are the sort of state level threats. Now turning to the threats from the federal government. There's sort of two kinds here. The first, advance, Peter. The first is what I'll call procedural intervention. This is the federal government trying to interfere in how how the election is organized and run. And I don't have much more to say on this than what Trevor already covered. We've already seen two examples of it from executive orders, one last year, one last month, from the president purporting to direct how voter registration, how vote by mail, how other aspects of election administration are supposed to work. President has no such power. The first order was already enjoined. The second, I think, will be enjoined shortly. But the concern is that we're going to get another one of these, or maybe more than one, and it could come shortly before the election. And it's easy enough for us lawyers, or folks sitting here on a Zoom in April, who don't have to run an election, to say, well, the president has no power to do that, so what? But if you're an election administrator, and it's a week before the election, and the president of the United States tells you you are required to do a certain thing in how you run your election, it's not so obvious that you can just say, well, forget that. I don't care what the president said, right? That creates a lot of uncertainty. It creates a lot of concern on the part of real life election officials all around the country. And so they're likely to interpret this differently. They're likely to apply it differently. And you're going to get the end result of that is going to be confusion, which can then be seized on in the post-election period to try to challenge results. So that's the sort of thing we're worried about in terms of the process. And then, of course, also, and you can advance, Peter, we're very worried about the federal government physically intervening in the election in November. And this could happen in a number of ways. I think one of the most likely and one of the most frightening scenarios is one that we've already seen twice this year, which is that the government could seize ballots, could seize voting equipment, could say, we are conducting an investigation. We're going to take all the voting materials from this county and from this city because we think something nefarious has happened. The federal government did that about 2 months ago in Atlanta. They did it, now fortunately not with live ballots, they did it with materials from the 2020 election. And one of the administration's allies did it more recently in California with ballots coming out of a 2025 election. And as I think John noted, the president has said openly and specifically that he was urged to seize voting materials in the 2020 election, and he didn't do it, and he wishes he had. So this is not a secret that this is, part of the playbook. And quite a bit of work is going into preparing for this, helping election officials understand what to do if it happens. And how to mitigate the damage. Another form of physical intervention that we could see is the deployment of either law enforcement or immigration enforcement officers in or around polling places. Now, that is illegal under federal law. It is under longstanding federal law, it is illegal to station any armed agent at a polling place. But that has not really been tested in recent American history. And the enforcement mechanism for that, would take a little bit of time, right? If agents showed up at the polls, we would need to get court orders to tell them to leave, and that's not an immediate procedure. And in the meantime, there can be quite a chilling effect. And so that prospect, of course, fueled by folks like Steve Bannon and others who have openly urged the administration to do this, is certainly high on the list of risks for November. There's one other scenario I want to mention, not because I actually think it is a particularly likely risk, but because I know there's been talk about it. There have been some pieces written, and there's been some discussion about, like, what if the election is fine, but then we get to January when the newly elected members of Congress are supposed to take their seats. And what if, the Speaker of the House says, no, I'm not going to seat them. I'm not going to do that. And in part, this is fueled by the fact that this happened last year with a representative who was elected out of Arizona, and the Speaker refused to swear her in for an extended period of time. I will just note that this, I think the way this has been described, it makes it sound like more of a risk than it is. Not to say that there couldn't be some sort of shenanigans, but just the way the mechanics of this work, the new Congress, if there's any disputes about who got elected in November, about who's rightfully entitled to a seat, those are resolved by the new Congress that's elected in November, not by the old Congress, not by the current Speaker of the House. And so the idea that the current Speaker sort of has some power to determine who gets seated in the next Congress sort of doesn't get the chronology quite right, and I wouldn't suggest that folks worry too much about that situation. Okay, so what do we do about all this? So the number one activity that's happening right now with us and with all of our allied groups all around the country is to plan out all of these scenarios, the ones we've talked about today, and many, many, many more. Plan them out as how they could unfold in different jurisdictions, in different counties, in different states, and have a plan in place to either stop them from happening or to mitigate the damage if they do. Sometimes that means litigation planning. Sometimes that means invoking the powers of, like, a state attorney general or a state secretary of state who has defined powers in that jurisdiction to take certain actions. But to ensure that by the time we get to November, we have a plan for anything that could come up. This is very labor intensive, very resource intensive, and it's been going on already for probably almost a year. For the 2026 election will continue to election day. You can advance, Peter. I've alluded a couple times today to the fact that election officials want to know answers to these questions. They are the ones who are going to be confronted with it. If somebody shows up with a search warrant and says, I want your ballots, right? It's the election official on the ground who's in the first instance going to have to decide what to do. So one of the primary mitigation strategies here is to make sure election officials know their rights, right? They know, don't just hand anything over. Call your lawyer, call your chief state election official, right? Take some time before you start giving over your materials. Similarly, if armed agents show up at your polls, get on the phone with somebody who has the power to, get an injunction against that. Don't start any sort of don't start anything that's gonna generate media that there's violence at the polls or confrontation at the polls or anything like that. So working with election officials is a huge aspect of this. Next. The public needs to know and the media needs to know the difference between what's normal and what's not. This is an area where it's really journalists who are going to be out there telling the public, a thing has happened, and they're going to either portray it as sort of like normal, or they're going to portray it as a threat to democracy, or somewhere in between. And so there's a lot of work being done to educate the media that, for example, if somebody serves a search warrant for ballots that are being voted, that is not normal. That is very, very dangerous. Versus other things that are sort of more run of the mill, some polling place didn't open on time or ran out of ballots. That's normal election stuff and isn't a sign of any sort of nefarious conduct necessarily. And then finally, we have the courts, and the courts have a very important role to play both before the election, and there's been a real explosion in the amount of election litigation in recent cycles. But I'll say that although that's sometimes presented as a bad thing, it doesn't have to be a bad thing, particularly in the pre-election window. If we have litigation before the election, we get court rulings about what are the rules, what are the laws, and we have that clarity going in. That can be a good thing, right? That everybody's operating under the same understanding of what the rules are. And that's better than waiting until the post-election period when it's sort of outcome determinative, and then the litigation is geared more towards changing an election result. Now we will have post-election litigation that has been a permanent fixture since the 2000 election. It gets more prominent every year. But the courts have generally, up to and including the Supreme Court, have done a really good job of dealing with sort of post-election litigation that's just intended to, sour grapes change election results, deal with that quickly, dispose of it quickly, and the courts have played a good, healthy role in that respect. So that's what I have for today in terms of what the threats are and the major strategies, and I think I'll turn it back to either John or Trevor.
Yeah, I'd thank you, Adav. I'd like to just add a touch to what Adav said and remind everybody that we have one of the significant dangers we have here is the change in personnel and structure today versus 2020. As Adav has noted, you had a situation after the 2020 election when Trump was saying it's all fraudulent, and it was stolen, and there was foreign interference, and ballots need to be seized, voting machines need to be seized. What we saw across the executive branch was a refutation of those statements. The Attorney General said there was no evidence of anything that had changed the results of that election. You had officials at Homeland Security and in the cyber community, cybersecurity community, saying that there wasn't any evidence of foreign interference, there was no evidence of fraud. Since then, of course, we now have the Trump 2 administration, and those people are all gone. I don't think anyone on this call believes that if the White House tells the Department of Justice they want voting machines seized, that the Department of Justice is going to say, I'm sorry, we don't have the legal authority to do that. As Adav noted, they're already doing that. The cybersecurity side is another area where the administration, in a sort of revengeful way, has simply dismantled the apparatus at the federal level that is supposed to protect us from foreign interference in elections. The agencies responsible have been gutted. The National Security Council's Election Security Group has been disbanded. The Foreign Malign Influence Center and the DNA has been disbanded. The FBI public corruption squad has been disbanded that focused on illegal activity during elections. So there is a risk here that either the executive branch, which is now seeded with election deniers from the 2020 cycle, people who claimed there was fraud or were willing to try to intervene, they're now in these positions of authority. And the checks on actual foreign influence, interference, disruption have been gutted. So, we're going to be in this, I think, potentially dangerous situation where you could, in fact, have foreign entities, one way or the other, trying to influence the midterms or create chaos or weaken faith in democracy. And you're not going to have government officials in place with the expertise to deal with that. Dob, do you want to add anything to that side of things?
No, I mean, that's the main difference between 2024 and now, right? That the federal government is not only not prepared to take a pro-democracy stance, but is likely to be a key adversary of the democratic process.
So, John, that sort of gives you an overview of what we see happening. There are lots of other issues we haven't talked about, but we're happy to dive in, answer questions as you wish.
I have a question, Trevor and Adav. You made wonderful presentations, but I wonder another change in personnel was at the Defense Department, Mr. Hegseth. You may recall in the first term, the military opposed invocation of the Insurrection Act to use the military to suppress dissent or protest at Lafayette Square. Now, it seems to me if you actually read the language of the Insurrection Act, which gives very, very broad authority whenever the president deems that there's interference with the enforcement of a federal or state law that the judicial process cannot in ordinary course address, then he can summon the military to supersede civilian authority. And I can't conceive of Mr. Hegseth opposing invocation of the Insurrection Act. And we know, I think, after the first, in the 2020 election, Mike Flynn had urged election machines be seized. Mr. Trump didn't go forward, but as you point out, he now says he regrets that. So what do you all see as the risk? And I see Mr. Trump claiming the Chinese are voting, the immigrants are voting, we can't enforce the election laws, because he's already stated he's not constrained by the Constitution. And we know the level of derangement because, according to some of his executive orders, Venezuela is attacking and invading the United States. Drug traffickers are enemies, military opponents invading the United States so he can use the military to kill them in the hundreds. So what do you see and how can we respond to an invocation of the Insurrection Act to just stop the election whatsoever? He could do something like, World War II, the British, Churchill didn't have elections. They had a unity government and said, well, we're at war, so we can't afford elections, and come up with some kind of concoction like that. Because he's obviously stated there isn't anything but his moral conscience that constrains him. And what would you see as a way to try to anticipate and counteract this?
Let me start with that last point and then turn it over to Adav. As you know, Bruce, we had elections during the Civil War with active battles going on, and soldiers were, for the first time, that's how we got absentee ballots, is that the soldiers in the field were able to vote. So we've never had, through all our wars and crises, a situation where, quote, elections were canceled. And of course, elections mandated by the Constitution, point one, are administered by the states. So the idea the president could, quote, cancel them, if he's already said he thinks they may be a mistake to have them, but that's different. And the Churchill example is, of course, that all parties agreed to enter into the government, so that there was a multi-partisan agreement to work together for the course of the war, which would not be the scenario here. But I agree with you that he certainly will seek to claim, whether it's national security or whatever grounds, to affect the results of the election, particularly if he doesn't like the results. I know Adav has been thinking about how the Insurrection Act fits into this picture. Do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between the action, the interference in the election, and the pretext for it, right? So there is going to be a pretext. It's not just going to be I don't like the results, so I'm taking this action. It's going to be there was, like you said, Bruce, the Venezuelans interfered, the Chinese interfered, the Iranians interfered, there were non-citizens voting, whatever, right? It's going to be a lie, right? So the question is, to what extent does the nature of that lie and the supposed power invoked to engage in the illegal activity matter? And it matters a little bit. I mean, it matters a lot to the folks who are working on sort of like public narrative, right? And countering mis and disinformation. But from the perspective of countering the activity itself, the illegal activity itself, the pretext is only a little bit relevant. In the end, if he's sending people to the polls to seize materials, whether it's military because the Insurrection Act has been invoked, or it's FBI agents because they've gotten search warrants, or it's any of the other mechanisms for doing that, it doesn't hugely matter what the pretext was, right? And the counter mechanisms are pretty similar. I'll say that, you know, the folks who are working on like the Insurrection Act itself know pretty strenuously that it doesn't give any particular election related power to the president, and that of course will be a point of pushback if this happens. But like in the end, we're going to stop. The goal is to stop them from seizing the materials, no matter what the pretext is. I'll say just lastly on the election cancellation front, that I feel that is not going to happen. I feel very confident that is not going to happen. That there is truly no way to effectuate that, right? The end of the term of Congress is set in the Constitution. The dates of the elections are set by federal law and they're administered by the states. So the president has literally there is no way for him to stop California and stop Virginia and stop these states from holding elections. And I don't think they will even try that. I think the vast majority of Americans would find that to be completely anathema to the American way of life.
But I just remind you that Mr. Trump has stated he's not confined by the Constitution or statutes. The only constraint is his moral.
Bruce, can you turn your volume up? Bruce,
Yeah,
can you?
I'm just saying that
turn,
that
it's hard to hear
just
you.
reminding maybe the audience, Mr. Trump has stated everything you've said, Adav, is absolutely accurate. And Trevor, Mr. Trump has stated he's not bound by the Constitution. He's not bound
Yes,
by statutes.
but as
The only thing that constrains him is his moral conscience.
that's true, but the courts are bound by the Constitution. So, and you know, there's the nice line of Chief Justice Roberts in the recent hearing where the Solicitor General said, "Well, you know, the world has changed. It's a whole new world." And the Chief Justice said, "Yes, but it's the same old Constitution." So there are constraints on the president, even if he chooses not to admit them or recognize them. The question is, how effective are those? How quickly can they be put in place? And as you know, all the issues of who can sue and how do you do it, who has standing, will the courts intervene, and that's going to depend on what the issue is in
But
particular.
remember, Mr. Trump has already flouted at least lower court orders. What would prevent him from saying, fine, Supreme Court has ruled against me. Heck with the Supreme Court. You know, he's got the criminal immunity with Trump versus U.S. At that point, I don't see any substitute other than impeachment and removal from office. Because
Can you repeat the question, please?
the courts do not have marshals. They don't have a military out there. Remember, Hamilton said they don't have the sword or the purse, so they're the least dangerous branch. And that's why it sounds like a broken record. Ultimately, you got to come back. If Congress doesn't do its job, we're done.
Well, so the question was from Bruce, what constrains the president who thinks he's not, in fact, governed by the Constitution and might ignore even Supreme Court orders? And his answer is impeachment, which is true, but it is sort of a chicken and an egg. Impeachment at that stage by the new Congress, which has to get there and be seated, which is the whole issue we're addressing of what happens if there is an attempt to prevent the will of the voters from being carried out, either in states in the certification process or later.
And I don't mean to belabor this, but just on the election cancellation point, because it's important. The point I was trying to make was not that it's illegal to cancel elections, although of course it is, and unconstitutional, although of course it is, and I agree with Trevor that no court is going to stand for that, and neither will the American people. But I was making a much more practical point. The president has no way to cancel an election. There's nothing he can do to effectuate that. He can say it, he cannot make that happen, right? He can send agents to polls, all the other things we talked about. He can order to be done and have them be done. But he cannot order an election not to happen and enforce that order. There's just no mechanism for it.
But let me just make one comment. Why can't he tell the military? And Hegseth, pulls out the whatever military force he says, and just occupy all these stations. We got a huge military force out there, and just prevent the elections physically from happening. Even though you're correct, even if they're being administered by the states, why can't he just redirect all of our military force to stopping the election by threats?
Because then we live in Russia, and the American people will not stand for that.
Well, that's the question. I'm not so sure that's going to be true, but I understand. I agree with your observation.
And I think the Supreme Court would not stand for it. So then you'd be in a situation where the court is saying what he's doing is illegal and unconstitutional. The people are in the streets. You would then have, as they say, joined the issue.
Yes, I'm saying that we just need to be prepared to join the issue. If that's how we won our independence from King George III. It wasn't by filing litigation. We didn't have any alternative. It's not something that I would cherish by any means, but sometimes that's all you have to do to ensure your rights.
I see a hand up there. I'm not very good at doing
Wendy,
this, but Wendy.
Wendy.
Hi, yes.
Good to see
Wendy
you.
Benchley here. And I think this is an absolutely terrifying, riveting conversation. But I'm of a practical mind, usually. And I was especially pleased to hear, Trevor and Adav, that you have been spending the last year with hundreds, if not thousands, of groups across the country, pulling together plans for how to counter these various nefarious threats to steal this election. And so what I'm specifically wondering about is, are there enough attorneys across the United States, and I would bet there are, that there could be one attorney with the proper credentials to be at every single, at least county polling place, that could be on call as soon as something happens to disrupt either the vote or the voting place, or to help somebody who knows they're registered but they turn them away. I'm interested to know whether the mobilization is such that you think that can happen.
I think the answer is yes, that will happen. Um, Aside from groups like ours, which are organizing now and drafting briefs that we would file and working with local officials in terms of understanding how one could immediately challenge an action in court. But beyond that, there are, in fact, thousands of volunteers. Each political party, of course, legally has official observers in the polling places. And each political party has a network to sound the alarm when there's a problem. On election day in 22 and 24, we had war rooms. We were part of national groups with war rooms covering different states so that every state was covered. The point is locally to get word out that there's a problem. The machine isn't working. And someone has been incorrectly challenged. There is somebody outside who appears to be threatening voters. And so there are warning systems that are in place in all of these elections and certainly will next time to send up a flare and say, here's what's happening. And then the lawyers, whether it's nonpartisan groups like us or party groups, immediately then will be prepared to react to that. So I
Yeah.
won't say there are necessarily lawyers in every polling place, but there are definitely observers there trained and connected to groups of lawyers and war rooms that will be ready to react if there's a problem in a polling place.
Yeah, I think I've been a challenger in many elections. And I guess what I was really hoping for is that there were actually sometimes when a challenge happens, it goes so quickly that you can't get the proper authority. So I guess what I was hoping is that there would be a massive mobilization across the country to have an attorney to have more legal attorneys there available more quickly. That's just my plea.
Adav, do you have anything to add to what I added to that?
Sure. Well, just Trevor's description of the mechanism was really great, and I think to your point, the way this would play out in reality is yes, if there's a single challenge, it may go too quickly for a response, but if there's somebody at a polling place, like in a highly concentrated area, and they're challenging voter after voter after voter, this could happen, right? Before that gets too far, there is going to be an alert to the national warning system, to the national war room that this is happening. And then we do have folks ready to deploy in each of these jurisdictions. And not only is it geographic that there's folks ready for each of these jurisdictions, there's also folks ready based on subject matter. So there's folks who are ready to deploy if it's a voter purge issue, or if it's a documentation issue, or if it's a violence at the polls issue. So between the geography and the subject matter, if there is something, it won't catch every person, but there's something systemic happening, something significant happening in terms of the number of affected voters, before that goes on too long, that does make its way to the National Warning Center, and then there are lawyers ready to go. I know Paul was
Paul Horn. Yeah. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Paul.
I'd like to ask a question to both Trevor and Fedor, and that is about Project 2025 and the business community's attitude to what you all are discussing. Are you in touch with any of the think tanks or business interests that authored Project 2025, in which the Trump administration has been implementing? Are they concerned about the dangers that you all are speaking of and fighting against? Are you getting any help from that community?
Well, I would start by saying if we're talking about heritage, where this was incubated, they have essentially become a partisan pro-Trump organization, and they are not concerned. That, as far as I know, I've seen no sign of them being concerned about any of this. But I think your underlying question is, what about the corporate community, the Chamber of Commerce, groups like that.
Exactly.
And of course, they rely on the rule of law. That's what makes America an attractive place to invest. That's what attracts capital from around the world. That's what enables businesses uh, to feel secure and functioning here. And I think there are plenty of signs that they are concerned by the illegal actions of this administration. I mean, certainly on something close to home for them, on the tariffs, they were filing briefs, they were suing. Um, they were saying this was activity beyond the authority of the president. And I think there are other areas where they understand that um, certainly threatening democracy and attempting to create a authoritarian government is not something that benefits business. And I would just add, I think playing favorites, as we've seen government agencies like the FCC do, and attacking some businesses and protecting friends of the president who run other businesses, is ultimately unhealthy for the country's business environment, and something I think that thoughtful business executives are very much aware of. Now, that's of course different than, are they speaking out? Are they attacking Trump? And there, I think the fear factor is a genuine consideration. People know that the federal government has enormous power, that Trump is vindictive and unpredictable, and they don't want to be a target. How we can give them either a sense that their people have their back, or that they need to put some steel in their spine, is a question I think for all of us.
If I could just follow up on Paul, Trevor, and Ed, you remember recently there are some defections from Heritage, including the 2025 authors, including Ed Meese.
Can you
I think,
up the sound on your computer? Because it's hard to hear you.
okay,
Just that little,
is
that
this better?
little, no, can't
No.
hear you.
What do I need to press here?
It's a little plus sign with um, there's a plus and a minus up there, F8 at the top.
There's a mic button.
A little,
Or just shout,
Yeah.
shout,
Just
Bruce.
shout, yeah. Okay, but anyway, there are defections. There are defections from Heritage, including Ed Meese and some other conservatives. I think they went and joined Mike Pence's 501c3. Have you explored seeing whether you might ally with them, since at least they seem to have at least a sliver of understanding of the rule of law, and the Heritage Foundation basically lining up behind despotism?
Yeah, we work with a whole range of organizations, many of which are populated by former office holders in Republican administrations. You know many of them.
Yeah.
Rule of Law Society, formerly Checks and Balances, being a prominent one. But a range of groups, Niskanen and R Street and others. I don't know, Adav, if we have worked with the Pence group or not, but we're certainly part of coalitions where these groups are there, and they share a concern for anti-authoritarianism, and don't necessarily share ideological views or policy views, but believe we have to protect the democratic system so that voters can express themselves and have their expressions honored.
And I would know, in terms of the business community, I'm just to emphasize the last thing Trevor said. So privately, business leaders will express all of the concerns that Trevor mentioned. Publicly, they're really, I mean, just to be blunt, they're really nowhere to be found. There was a brief moment after January 6, 2021, when the business community said this is unacceptable. And that lasted 3 to 6 months. And by by about 6 months after that, most of that public stance had either been explicitly sort of walked back or very quietly walked back. And the problem that we are facing now is that it's a collective action problem. Nobody wants to be first. Every business leader is concerned that if they stick their neck out, the administration is going to, come after them. It's clear why they would think that. And so they'll really only do it if there's safety in numbers, and how to organize that safety in numbers, and how to sort of figure out what the right trigger is to activate that is a very tricky issue. Folks may have seen right before we got on this call tonight, the administration indicted a nonprofit organization, criminally indicted a nonprofit organization, one of our allies. It's this is a thing that happens in authoritarian regimes, right? Groups that displease the administration get charged with bogus crimes. So that's what they're doing just to a civil rights group. So, the fear among the business community is problematic, but you also sort of see where it's coming from, and we have to manage it. We can't just sort of wish it away.
How much in litigation does it help if you have amicus, or you have Republicans and Democrats signing the same brief? How much do you think that's important in convincing a judge, or is it marginal in your litigation strategy?
Adav, you want to start that one?
I think it depends on the court. I think the Supreme Court is pretty impervious to amicus briefs from any source on any topic. They know what they're going to do and they do it. The lower down you go in the court system, the more it matters, because judges are less ideological and they care more about getting the answer right. So it is helpful to give some validation, some cross-partisan validation at the lower levels, but I think that value diminishes pretty rapidly as you get higher in the court system.
Yeah, I think the point that Adav just made, that for lower courts, reassurance that something they're being asked to do is not a purely partisan move is very helpful. To have a group of Republican former office holders urge them to do something in a suit brought by Democrats, I think gives the judges a sense of comfort that they are not themselves being partisan here in acceding to the request. I think similarly, we find there's credibility for us as a nonpartisan organization in filing a brief or representing a party where the other actors in that suit are partisans. I think it again gives us some extra credibility in the court, something to hang their hat on, that they're being asked to do something by a group that does not have partisan motives.
I have more questions from the audience.
I just wanted to say it's been a marvelous presentation. I really think we owe a debt to Trevor and Adav. I think you're critical here to trying to save us from disaster in November, and prophylactic efforts like this are just wonderful. So I think we really want to extend our enormous gratitude and appreciation for showing up tonight.
Well, I thank you, Bruce, particularly coming from you after your years in this field and protecting the Constitution. I appreciate that. As Adav said, we're not alone in this. We work with a large number of groups, and we wake up every morning grateful for the chance to go out and engage in these battles.
Trevor, I'd like to, can you address the whole gerrymandering issue? I know Paul Smith, took the case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided not to get near it. Can you kind of go through that and then talk about how it's playing out in Texas and Virginia,
Sure.
the referendum?
Yep. We have fought for years against gerrymandering as an organization. We've done model nonpartisan commissions and urged states to adopt them. We've worked with citizens groups around the country when they have adopted a nonpartisan approach. We were involved with Utah in drafting their constitutional amendment, and Michigan in defending their independent commission in court. So that's our history. What we're seeing, and then the Supreme Court case, which we fought hard, almost won, and then Justice Kennedy decided to punt and didn't tell anyone he was going to retire 2 weeks later. And his successor was the key vote against allowing federal courts to enforce what the court basically said was a constitutional mandate against gerrymandering. You had a majority of the justices saying gerrymandering was wrong. The dispute was, could federal courts usefully intervene? And I think in a sort of laughable decision, they said, oh, we wouldn't know how to do this, even though you had by then a large number of lower federal courts that had, in fact, come up with tests and determined what was or was not a excessively partisan gerrymander. So with federal courts closed, the answer to gerrymandering has to be federal legislation. And the Supreme Court specifically said, we can't touch it, but Congress can. It could mandate for federal districts that you have nonpartisan lines. And there have been proposals in Congress to do that. The House passed gerrymandering reform in the last session, which was then defeated in the Senate because it couldn't surmount the filibuster. You could either tell states they have to have independent commissions, or you could say you can't gerrymander, you figure out how not to do it. And in both cases, explicitly say federal courts have a mandate to enforce that provision. So there is a way out of this mess. What we're seeing this year is why we need it. This race to the bottom, started by Texas and by Trump, with Trump saying to Texas, you need to give me 5 seats so that I can help rig this election, very publicly. And California threatening that if Texas did that, California would gerrymander the other way to even it out. And then Texas did it and California did it. I will say there's an interesting difference between Texas and California and Virginia, which voted today, and I haven't seen any results yet, which is both Virginia and California had independent commissions and a non-legislative process in place by law, by constitution. And so both of those states have had to go to their voters and ask the voters' permission and approval to change their process. I apologize. They've both done it on a temporary basis for until the next census in 2030, and then under their proposals, now law in California, it reverts to an independent commission. Texas did none of that. It didn't get voter approval. The legislature just did it, drawing the partisan map, and there's no end in sight to that gerrymandering in Texas, whereas the other 2 states, California got voter approval to do it for 2 cycles. Virginia is asking for voter approval. But none of this is a good idea. And I think we've seen really significant backsliding with these gerrymandered maps. Where we have fought them. We've argued in Missouri that the map they've done is unconstitutional under the state constitution, which says you can redistrict once a decade after the census, which they've done. So we've argued that it's unconstitutional for them to do it in the middle of the decade. And Utah, we've been very busy in court defending the results of the independent commission against the legislature trying to overturn it. And that state Supreme Court in Utah, with a conservative state Supreme Court, has time and again unanimously upheld the fair map process and the independent process that the voters there had approved. Florida is waiting in the wings. The governor has postponed their legislative session, I assume, to see what happens today in Virginia, because the battle in Florida is shaping up between the governor and the Republican leadership in the legislature, which is nervous about gerrymandering too much and ending up putting Republican seats in jeopardy if you have a wave election. So I think depending on what Virginia does, we'll see how aggressive Florida is, but they show every sign of wanting to proceed with their own gerrymander. So again, the answer here has to be a nationwide solution. You can't try to do this with some states changing their system and others not.
The New York Times, with 65% of the votes counted, is reporting that the noes are ahead in Virginia by about 4%.
That's not a small margin. And it depends, obviously, as we know, it depends on where those votes counted are from. And the Democrats were thought to be ahead in early voting. And so if those include the early votes, that does not bode well for changing the Virginia law. I don't know what's in the 65%, which is the key question. But I will say that the Virginia battle, I'm a Virginian and watched all this, was not as clear as the California messaging. California basically said, stop Trump. They didn't talk about gerrymandering. They didn't talk about new districts. They just said, stop Trump. And my sense is that what I've seen of the Virginia messaging has not been that direct, and the Republican messaging sounds like the world's greatest reformers. Stop gerrymandering. Don't let politicians in smoke-filled rooms in Richmond take your voice away. Fight for fair maps. In fact, the Republican group is called Fair Maps, which is usually what the groups favoring reform are. So we'll see where it goes. But that it wouldn't surprise me if Virginia voters, like voters almost everywhere given a choice, have said we don't like gerrymandering. It's just in California they dislike Trump more, and I don't think changes the view that we need a nationwide answer to this.
And
Trevor,
oh,
yeah, go ahead.
We talked mostly tonight about sort of 2026 and short-term issues, but it is a chance to highlight that, like, ultimately, if we survive this moment, right, we need to fix these systems. We need to make sure that we're not in this situation again in a whole bunch of ways, with regard to executive power, with regard to gerrymandering, with regard to corruption, which we haven't even talked about tonight. And so, there are different solutions to different of these problems. Like Trevor noted, there are ways that Congress could address gerrymandering. There are even bigger picture ways, right? Like we don't have to use single member districts for congressional races. You could do something more like a proportional representation system where each state votes. If you have 8 US reps, people vote by party and seats get allocated by party, right? You can't gerrymander a proportional representation system. Anyway, I'm not saying that is the answer. I'm just pointing out that, like, we're going to need some real big picture thinking, assuming we get to a moment where we can make reforms that ensure that we're not just going through this cycle of, like, fighting back autocracy and then holding the line and then fighting back autocracy. We need to do things to get out of this.
Yeah, I guess the question is, where does gerrymandering fit in this mosaic of all these things we've been talking about tonight? And I would like to come back and discuss the corruption thing before we close. But where does it fit? I mean, is this just a Trump phenomena, or is this a new normal, or what are we have these battleground states with the electoral college and the presidential. Now it looks like we got battleground states in the gerrymandering rule setting. How do you, what's the way to think about this? How do you put it in a context?
Yeah,
In relation.
I think the new normal is that Democratic states, largely California is an example, the leading example, are saying, "Hey, if Republican states are going to aggressively gerrymander, we're not going to unilaterally disarm." There was pressure on New York, which has a constitution that prohibits gerrymandering, to change that. There was pressure in Maryland to change that. And if we don't do something federally with legislation, I think we will see a retreat on both sides to gerrymandering. Illinois, the Republicans have fought for years against the Democratic gerrymander there. The Democrats aren't going to give it up absent federal legislation. And the question is, aside from what Trump is trying to do this year, which was pre-cook the results and add what was originally estimated to be 8 or 10 seats to the Republican column, which might be enough to swing Congress. Aside from that, what's the problem with gerrymandering? The problem is it makes Congress much more polarized. You end up with all these safe seats in either party where the whole election is decided in the primary with a very small percentage of voters participating, and the deciders in those primaries being the party base. So you get more liberal, rigid Democrats, more conservative, rigid Republicans, and no incentive to compromise because the base doesn't like compromise and will attack you. So you end up with a more polarized Congress, which then presents the whole problem on a national basis.
So can you just give us a little background on, we've got roughly, out of the 435 seats, about 60 are open or where there's real competition. And then now
the usual estimate is that they're only about 10%, so 40 that are truly going to be battle
40. Okay.
states.
Yeah.
Now, if a member resigns and it's slightly competitive, that changes things because now you have new people and you don't have the advantage of incumbency. So that in some years, and there are a lot of members this year retiring, that can increase. But most of what I've seen says that because of gerrymandering, there are fewer swing seats than there used to be. I mean, there are years where Democrats or Republicans would pick up 40 seats. And most of the political commentators I've seen have said that even in a big swing year is almost impossible to do now because a 5 or 10% swing just doesn't change that number of seats in Congress because they're so polarized one way or the other. Doesn't mean you can't have a change of control, but
right. So that makes this whole action in Texas and California and Virginia, it puts much more pressure on that kind of
yes, it
thing,
does.
Right.
Correct.
It's funneling all the competition now in a new. It's
Yes.
taking gerrymandering to a different level.
Yes, it is.
If I could ask a kind of a related question, Trevor, and that is, when we go back to 1962, one person, one vote, it wasn't gerrymandering in the sense of partisan drawing of lines to favor one party over another, but it was designed at least to have equal numbers in equal districts. How did that, if at all, in your judgment, affect one person, one vote, affect the politics, the partisanship, the division, a more, I would say, fair system? Just the one person, one vote, or was it marginal?
Well, it provided more equal representation of citizens and of voters because the reason you got that decision was that legislatures had left districts in place for decades, even though the populations had shifted. And so specifically, you had rural agricultural districts with a much smaller population than a city, and yet the rural district might have two representatives, or a representative, and the city a representative, with a difference of 10 to 1 in population. So the effect of one person, one vote was literally to say everyone should have the same shot at having equal representation in Congress and in the state legislatures. And that made an enormous difference because it shifted political power from acreage to people. And it shifted power to where the voters were. But if the reaction to that is to say now we're going to divide it up again and try to prevent groups of voters from having a political say, that's gerrymandering. Utah is the example where the Republican legislature there, for some time now, has taken the largest urban center in the state, which is Salt Lake City, and they've divided it into 5 pieces. And they have given a slice of Salt Lake City to each of the congressional districts in Utah that are dominated by the more rural areas of those districts. And so you end up with 5 rural Congress people and no representation of the large population center of Salt Lake City. And so what the nonpartisan map would have done is give Salt Lake City its own congressional seat, representing those interests in common and adhering to the redistricting standards of a coherent and geographic entity. And that's what ultimately the state Supreme Court has approved there. So for the first time in years, Salt Lake City will actually end up with a congressperson who lives in Salt Lake City and can represent those voters.
Great. I'm a friend of Rocky Anderson. I'm hoping he runs for that seat.
So to end, Adav, you were, where is the corruption, your work in that? How does that relate to our overall subject tonight?
Right. So one of the many troubling aspects of the current administration is that it's deeply corrupt in the sense that many of the actors, high-level actors in the administration, including the president and his family, are acting their own financial interests rather than in public interest. And so our organization, Campaign Legal Center, this is our bread and butter. Trevor founded CLC as a campaign finance, money and politics, anti-corruption organization, and that was our main focus for many years. And we're still probably we are still the largest money and politics organization in the country, despite the significant expansion of our many other lines of work. So what we are trying to do in this environment, like campaign finance reform, is not going to happen right now. Congress is not going to pass, and the president is not going to sign a major campaign finance reform bill in 2026 or 27 or 28. What we are doing is making sure that we investigate and expose the corruption and track it and make journalists aware of it and ultimately make the American people aware of it. Now, we're not telling them how to vote. They can do whatever they want with this information. But we think, and the precedents from other countries show that awareness of an autocratic regime's corruption is frequently one of the key reasons that the autocrat fails. And there's examples of this from countries all around the world. When the people realize that the autocrat is enriching themselves and enriching their family, that trade-off becomes unacceptable to much of the voting populace. So we are investing heavily in research and investigations and data mining, and drawing the connections to show the corrupt transactions, as the screenshot that Peter just brought up is one example. We have an actual tracker, we call it the corruption tracker, and disseminating that information so that people can know about the corruption happening at the very highest levels of the federal government.
Well, thank you very much. This is, as Bruce said, you guys gave a very comprehensive, impressive presentation. We really appreciate it. You're our go-to person on the organization on elections, and I thought the discussion tonight was very, very good. Thank you.
I will give you the update, which is rolling along. Now the no votes are 50.7 and the yes votes are 49.3, with 75% of the votes in. So, as often happens, too close to call. But John, thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be back with the Committee for the Republic. Adav and I appreciate the chance to talk these issues through with you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.